The electronic checklist is if you have a ICAS message and you have a box, a white box in front of it, it means that that is a checklist icon that appears, and that means there is an electronic checklist procedure. That means there are procedural steps. So that would tell us to go to the electronic checklist to do that checklist. If no checklist icon is in front of the message, like in this case autopilot, and there's nothing there, that's the same as in the 400 having a careted prompt in front of it. Remember, the caret used to mean, if you had that in front of it, that it was for crew awareness only, and there are no procedural steps in the QRH. You could go to the QRH, you could look at this, and it would tell you what the condition is, but there's no step 1, step 2, step 3. There's no procedure for this. But it will tell you what the message means if you go to the QRH. Well, in this case, there just is nothing in front of it. So the caret has been removed, and if you don't see a box in front of it, it means there's no procedural steps. We still need to go to the checklist to see what it is, but you're going to see that it just says what the condition is, and there'll be no step 1, step 2, step 3 kind of thing. You get the checklist by selecting the checklist display on the ICAS display select panel. And when you select checklist, it's going to come down to whatever MFD you have selected. Usually that's the lower center would be used primarily to display the checklist, because both crew members can see it easily. But you could display it on the right inboard, you could display it on the left inboard, or you can display it on the lower center. Normally it's displayed here. It's easiest for both crew members to see that way. And you'll notice that if we were to select the checklist and it's the first flight of the day, then you'll get the pre-flight checklist. If you see gray boxes, like we do next to oxygen, that means that it's an open loop item. Open loop items need to be completed by us. They can't be completed by the airplane itself. The airplane can sense in some case whether something is true or not true. And if it's true, it can check it off. If it's not true, it can not check it off. But it has the ability to determine what position some switches are in. But in the case of the oxygen, for example, it doesn't know if we tested it. It doesn't know if it's 100%. It doesn't know any of that. So it has a gray box there saying, if you've checked this, if you've tested it and you've checked it to 100%, go ahead and check me off. So we have to manually check the gray boxes off. Anything that would be a closed loop item would mean that you're going to have no gray box next to it, but it will either be white or green. If it's green, it means that that is sensed to be true, and it'll check it off automatically. So if we set the parking brake and the parking brake is set, the airplane can sense that the parking brake is set. And so it says, okay, that's true, that it is set. And so it makes it green and it checks it off. Anything that's a completed checklist item would be green. If the parking brake was released, it would still have no gray box in front of it, but it would say parking brake set in white. And until the parking brake is set, it's not going to change to green, and the checklist is not going to be complete. So a not completed item would be white, a completed item would be green, and a false or an overridden item would be in cyan or a blue color. So you can see here that if we were to do the pre-flight checklist, and captain calls for the pre-flight checklist, the first officer would push the checklist button, up would come the pre-flight checklist, and he would say, just like we do normally, oxygen, and then the captain would say tested 100%, and then I, as the first officer, would say tested 100%, and then I would take my rotary cursor selector and highlight it over the oxygen gray box, and then go ahead and push select and check it off. And when I check it off, it turns green, indicating that I've accomplished it. And then I would say flight instruments. And then he would say heading 334, altimeter 294 inches. And then I'd say heading 334, altimeter 294 inches. And again, the cursor would automatically move down to this position. Then I would go ahead and push select on the rotary cursor control, and it would check that item off. Once these two items are checked off, everything's green, the checklist would be complete, and it would say checklist complete down here, and then I don't have to read these because they're already sensed to be true. They're green. I don't need to read them. The only thing I need to read are these two. Oxygen tested 100%, tested 100%, flight instruments, heading, blah, 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 altimeter, blah, blah, blah. Check it off. Pre-flight checklist complete, because you'll see the complete down here. So when it's complete, like you see here, we check this off, we check this off. Didn't have to read these because they were already sensed to be true. They're the closed loop items. These are open loop items. And then it says checklist complete. And then you'll notice the cursor will automatically come down here to normal. And when you push the selector on the rotary cursor control, it's going to go to the next checklist in the normal menu, which is going to be the before start checklist at that point. One thing we do during pre-flight, the first officer, is that when you're doing your ICAS check, when you're checking primary and secondary ICAS, one of the things you're going to do is go to the, you're going to select checklist, and you're going to go to the resets. You're going to push that. You're going to get the reset page, and then we're going to reset all. And all that does is it clears out everything so that when you select checklist, it starts with the first checklist in the normal checklist items, which is the pre-flight checklist. And we want to make sure. We also check that the checklist database is also current. There's going to be two checklist databases, and we want to make sure that we're in the current range for the checklist database. So again, another database we have to check, just like we had to check the airport map database. We have to check the FMC database. We also have to check the checklist database, because that has to be kept up to date. So those two things, we have to check the checklist database and then go to reset all and check that as well. And come down here and highlight it and then select it. And then when you go back to checklist, it'll go to the pre-flight checklist. The normal menu, you can see it's just like if you're looking at your QRH, it's pre-flight, before start, before taxi, before takeoff, after takeoff, descent, approach, landing, shutdown, secure. This is the Boeing. You know, airlines, if they had different checklists, they'd have different things in here. They can have this customized to what their procedures are, what their checklist is. And there's the resets that we normally go down to, and then here's the non-normal menu if we needed to select a non-normal menu. Normally, if you have a non-normal problem, you're going to have the ICAS message, and when you push checklist, it's going to take you to that non-normal procedure automatically. But for example, if you had something that was an unenunciated, like two-engine inoperative landing, you'd have to go to the non-normal and go to the two-engine inoperative landing, so you'd have to select that. There are also conditional items for closed loop conditional items and open loop conditional items. So an example of a closed loop conditional item would be if an APU fire detection is inoperative, then you're going to have APU is not running or APU is running. And the airplane is basically going to choose, it knows whether it's running or not running. So it'll automatically choose the one that's appropriate and then highlight that in green and check it off. And then if there's any open loop items, you can see here there is one, that if the APU is running, plan to shut down the APU as soon as practicable. If it's a open loop conditional item, then you're going to have to tell it something. So in this case, you can see it's got a flap position is between 1 and 5 or at 5. And we need to tell it yes or no. And then if we tell it yes, it'll take one course of action. If we say no, it'll take another course of action. So here it looks like we said it's not between 1 and 5, or it's not at 5. No, it's not. So we selected no. And then it went down and gave you this one. Flight position is between 5 and 20. And then we'd select yes for that. So these are, we have to tell it what it's asking us what the situation is. And we have to tell it what the situation is, because there's some different conditions that could be selected here based on the non-normal that you're operating with. So we'll look at some of those. Here's your non-normal menu, and you can see here's where you find your unenunciated checklists, and then all the individual systems that are in the QRH. Again, most of these I'm not going to have to go to unless I need to go to them because I need to get to something that is not selected automatically for me. But in most cases, when you get the ICAS message and you push checklist, it's going to take you to the appropriate non-normal checklist without you having to go search for this. If you have an engine fire, normally after you bring the thrust lever to idle and you bring the fuel control switch to cutoff and you pull the engine fire switch and the fire light remains illuminated and you rotate it to the stop, that's automatically going to trigger a timer. And so right after you do that, you can go to the ECL and you'll see that these items are closed loop items. They will automatically go green, and you've already rotated to the stop the number 1 fire switch, and so it turned green and checked it off. And then now it says wait 30 seconds. It's an open loop item, so you need to check it off. But we're waiting for the time to time down from 30 seconds on to 0. So after we go, thrust lever, fuel control switch, fire switch, pull, light's still illuminated, rotate to the stop, hold for 1 second, I can go right to the checklist, and then I don't have to hit the clock. It's going to start a clock for me automatically. Any notes will show up, like in this case, if we had flaps primary, the condition was 1 or more flap groups are in the primary mode has failed. Ground proximity flap override switch to override. This is probably a closed loop item that was white, but once I take the ground prox flap override switch and bring it to override, it'll turn green and check it off. And then note, plan additional time for slower flap operation. Note, use flaps 20 and VREF 20 for landing. Well, these are the notes, and they're going to stay even though I've completed the checklist complete. You'll notice that a notes box will appear down here, because there's notes that we may have to review prior to landings, and these stay here. And then one of the checklist items on the descent checklist is to check notes, and so we would check notes that could be applicable for landing, and then review those notes again. A checklist incomplete norm can come for